In 2024, after losing more than 90,000 yuan in a single harvest because of an invasive species, Mr. Huang made what seemed like the worst possible decision for his 300 mu of rice fields in Guangdong. Instead of continuing to tend the crop, he released 60 ducks straight into the paddies. His neighbors came over and laughed at what they saw as a reckless move, convinced that the crowded ducks would trample the rice plants. On social media, many people were just as puzzled, asking, "Why is he using rice to raise ducks?" Huang did not care. Day after day, he stood at the edge of the fields, watching the ducks waddle between the rows of rice, their once white feathers turning black from the mud, their bills constantly searching for small clusters of pink eggs. A few weeks later, something had disappeared. Something that had frustrated even some of China's most experienced experts for a long time. But the strangest part was still to come. 5 months later, the ducks had created many other changes as well, far beyond what scientists had calculated. So how did those ducks manage to save one of China's most important food sources, while also creating 3 enormous economic benefits at the same time? It all began with an unusual eating trend in China. In 1981, South American snails were imported into Guangdong on a massive scale. They seemed to have everything going for them. They reproduced quickly, provided plenty of meat, and were novel enough to spark curiosity in the market. Just 1 year later, they had already been introduced to at least 11 provinces. But only 10 years later, large numbers of snail farms went bankrupt. Instead of destroying the snails, irresponsible farmers released millions of them into rivers, ponds, canals, and waterways. By 2003, China officially placed the golden apple snail on its list of dangerous, invasive species, but by then, it was already too late. From southern China, the snails spread northward, invading more than 20 provinces. Imagine you are a farmer in Guangdong. One day, your young rice seedlings are still green and healthy. The next morning, you walk outside and see pink clusters of snail eggs covering the field edges and plant stems. Look down into the water, and the rice you just planted has been reduced to short, severed stubs. The snails do not slowly nibble away at the plants, they bite straight through the stems, killing the rice completely. In just 1 or 2 nights, an entire field can be eaten bare. Farmers are forced to replant, losing even more money and time. In Guangxi, yields from a single crop fell by as much as 80%. Do you see how serious this became? The golden apple snail was attacking one of the country's most important food sources and threatening the food security of a nation of more than 1 billion people. Why didn't they simply catch the snails and eat them? Golden apple snails are one of the worst species to use as food. Their meat is tough and bland, and they can be toxic. They can carry parasites that cause eosinophilic meningitis, neurological disorders, and even death. In 2006, 160 people in Beijing became ill, and around 100 had to be hospitalized in cases linked to eating raw snails. The government encouraged people to collect the snails by hand, destroy their eggs, and set nets to catch them. But all of these methods failed. A month of catching snails could not keep up with what they could reproduce in a single night. Molluscicides were more effective, but fish, shrimp, and even young rice plants died along with the snails. While modern agriculture kept searching for more extreme solutions, another clue led us back to the remote mountains. The Dong people of Guizhou have been raising ducks directly in rice paddies for 600 years. At first, the purpose was simply to let the ducks take advantage of the natural food available in the fields, while farmers reduced the cost of raising them. But over many growing seasons, they began to notice something very strange. Rice fields with ducks usually had fewer insects and weeds, and golden apple snails also disappeared in large numbers. Not just a slight reduction in many areas, they almost vanished entirely. The rice in those fields looked healthier, suffered less damage, and had fewer pests. There was no major study or large-scale project behind it. Farmers simply observed the results and passed the experience from one household to another, from one region to the next. Today, this approach is known as ecological engineering. But in the 20th century, chemical fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, and machinery were faster. Ducks gradually disappeared from the rice fields. Only when golden apple snails became increasingly difficult to control did people begin looking back at this old-fashioned method. We now understand how ducks eating snails help protect China's most important food source. But how did they also create 3 enormous economic benefits? It is not as simple as you might think. Keep watching to find out exactly how. But while China was still waiting for duck-based farming projects to be adopted on a large scale, golden apple snails had already spread across many Asian countries, including Thailand, Malaysia, and Vietnam. They traveled in different ways. People accidentally transported them, or just a few eggs stuck to plant stems were enough to start a new invasion. But when these snails reached Japan, the story took a different turn. One man studied China's duck flocks more carefully. He knew what he had to do if this farming method was ever going to be recognized and adopted around the world instead of relying on harmful chemicals. His name was Takao Furuno, a farmer in Fukuoka. He was not a professor, and he did not have a laboratory. His family's roughly 3-2-hectare farm was his laboratory. Furuno had been pursuing organic farming since the late 1970s, and around 1989, after years of experimentation, he began developing a controlled system known as IGMO. These were not ordinary ducks. They were hybrids between wild and domestic ducks, hardy enough to live out in the fields but still easy to manage. What came next was even simpler. After the rice was transplanted and given enough time to take root, very young IGMO ducks were released into the paddies. One FAO document describes ducks about 7 days old being released within roughly 10 days after transplanting and remaining in the fields for nearly 2 months. At this stage, Takao Furuno was able to explain to the world, why don't the ducks trample the rice or simply eat it? Once the rice plants have taken root but have not yet produced grain, the young ducks mainly search for easier food moving through or growing in the water: insects, young weeds, and small organisms. Later studies of IGMO behavior confirm that they actively eat both weeds and insects. One tracked duck even traveled about 3.8 kilometers in 17 hours inside a rice field measuring just 0.2 hectares. But once the rice begins forming panicles and grain, the ducks have to be removed, because at that point they may start eating the rice itself. What Furuno gradually realized was that he did not simply have a walking pesticide. Every step the ducks took stirred the surface mud and kept the water moving. Their bills pulled up young weeds before they could establish strong roots. They ate crop pests, and IGMO studies recorded lower numbers of plant hoppers during the early stages of rice growth. Duck manure also fell directly into the paddies, returning organic matter and nutrients to the soil. Furuno even added loaches and azolla, turning a single rice field into a system where the waste from one organism became a resource for another. From a single problem, ducks ended up solving several others while bringing farmers many benefits, especially financial ones. In Japan, a 1998 comparison found that IGMO fields produced about 4.15 tons of rice per hectare, not higher than the roughly 4.5 tons from conventional fields. But because the rice could be sold at a higher price and the ducks became a second product, profits in the comparison reached about 134,200 yen, compared with 75,000 yen under the conventional system. Yes, farmers do not necessarily need to harvest more rice to make more money. Furuno did not keep the method in Japan. Through books, travel, and farmer training, he helped spread it, especially in China. A large-scale analysis found that rice duck systems could increase rice yields by about 7% on average, while a 2020 co-culture experiment in China recorded an increase of as much as 1% under specific conditions. But the real profit came from the things farmers no longer had to buy as much of: herbicides, pesticides, and part of their fertilizer needs were replaced by the ducks' foraging activity and manure. One assessment in China estimated the total value of ecosystem services from the rice duck system at about 18,105 yuan per hectare, around 15.6% higher than conventional rice farming. And at the end of the season, that workforce did not simply become a wasted expense. The grown ducks could be sold for meat, while female ducks could also produce eggs. This is not a small market. The FAO has recorded China as one of the countries with the world's largest duck populations. Historical data for the category of other poultry eggs, which mainly included duck and quail eggs, showed that China accounted for as much as 77% of global production in 2013. China's egg industry as a whole had a processing value exceeding 400 billion yuan in 2022. But compared with money, something even more important was beginning to return: life in the rice fields. A field free of snails but stripped of its natural predators is still a fragile ecosystem. In Chinese rice paddies, the web of life can be incredibly rich, with more than 1,300 species of natural enemies recorded, from wolf spiders, ladybugs, and damselflies to parasitic wasps. By reducing reliance on chemicals and bringing ducks back into the fields, farmers were doing more than controlling snails. The ducks waded through the mud, hunted insects, stirred the water, and left manure behind, creating small but constant changes. And because of those changes, one species after another had a chance to return. The success of the rice duck system did not stop in Japan or China. IGMO farming was introduced or tested in South Korea, China, Vietnam, the Philippines, Laos, Cambodia, Malaysia, and Bangladesh. What is interesting is that each place turned ducks into a different kind of tool. In Sabah, Malaysia, researcher Susin Teo did not simply ask, "Do ducks eat snails?" He asked a harder question. Which type of duck does the job best? In 2001, he compared several breeds and found that the biggest duck was not necessarily the most effective. The large-bodied Cherry Valley breed adapted poorly to muddy rice fields, while Williams, Siam, and Taiwan ducks were more agile. In the end, the research showed that around 5-10 ducks per hectare, allowed to forage continuously for 1 to 2 months, could reduce snail density from about 5 snails per square meter to fewer than 1 per square meter. But if they were released too early, the ducks themselves could damage young rice plants. In other words, Malaysia proved a rather harsh point. You cannot simply buy a huge number of ducks and dump them into a field. The wrong breed, the wrong age, or the wrong timing can turn the solution into another problem. In the Philippines, the story shifted toward a more complex ecosystem. Farmers had long moved duck flocks from one field to another after harvest so they could eat leftover rice grains and reduce feed costs. Later trials showed that mallard ducks could reduce weed biomass by about 52–58%, while other studies recorded golden apple snail densities dropping by 74–84% when very high duck densities were used. Filipino farmers also combined rice plus ducks plus tilapia plus azolla, allowing duck manure to support aquatic organisms, azolla to provide nutrients and feed, and the ducks to control weeds, insects, and snails. In Bangladesh, people focused on a more practical question. Could poor farmers actually make more money? The PTRRA program, managed by IRRI together with Bangladeshi partners, found that rice duck plots produced average yields about 20% higher, while production costs fell by around 30% because farmers no longer needed to weed and could reduce chemical inputs. In Sylhet, smallholder farmers managed fields of about 0.4 hectares this way. But the most impressive scene appeared in Nakhon Pathom, Thailand, in 2020. A barn door opened, and around 10,000 khaki Campbell ducks poured out in a white stream across flooded rice fields. The flock owner, Apiwat Chalermklin, who was 34 at the time, rotated 4 groups of ducks through the paddies. They ate golden apple snails, insects, and leftover rice grains, while trampling down rice stubble and making the soil easier to plow. For the duck farmer, the fields were an almost free source of food. For the rice farmer, the ducks were a mobile pest control crew that needed no chemical sprayer. After about 5 months of foraging in the fields, the ducks were brought back to the farm, where they continued laying eggs for years. From just a few ducks in small research plots to 10,000 birds covering an entire field, the same idea changed shape as it moved from one country to another. Malaysia found the right duck, the Philippines built an entire ecosystem, Bangladesh turned it into a livelihood strategy, South Korea created value through organic rice, and Thailand turned duck flocks into a mobile workforce. That was the point when rice duck farming stopped being just a trick for controlling snails. It had become an agricultural model that could adapt to different landscapes across Asia. Even though this approach seems incredibly simple, you cannot just buy a few hundred ducks, release them into a rice field, and expect every problem to disappear. Rice duck farming works more like a carefully managed system than a traditional farming trick. FAO materials show that stocking densities can vary widely from one system to another, from just a few dozen to several hundred ducks per hectare. Some systems use around 200–350 ducks per hectare because the right density depends on the duck breed, the age of the ducks, water depth, and field conditions. If there are too few ducks, they may not be able to control weeds and pests effectively. But too many are not good either. They compete for food, stir up the water too aggressively, and the ducks themselves may grow poorly. Recent research has even found that increasing stocking density from 75 to 300 ducks per hectare can delay the age at which they begin laying and reduce egg production. Timing is just as important. Imagine newly transplanted rice plants that are still nothing more than young stems barely rooted in the soil. If large ducks run into the field at this stage, the same feet that can weed the field may instead trample the rice into the mud. On the other hand, keeping the ducks in the field until the rice begins forming grain is also risky, because by then, insects and weeds are no longer the only things that attract them. Practical guidelines therefore call for removing the ducks before the grain-forming stage. And that is not all. Ducks need stable enough water levels to move around, fencing to keep them from wandering into neighboring fields, and protection from disease and predators. In Malaysia, Su Sin Teo's research even showed that the large-bodied Cherry Valley breed adapted less well to muddy rice fields than lighter, more agile breeds. This story is not over. We have to admit that these farmers are remarkably clever and ambitious, because they truly did not stop with the rice duck model. Once they realized that a rice field could function like a living ecosystem, they kept expanding the idea into more complex systems, where multiple species coexist and each one performs a different role. One particularly notable example is the rice duck crayfish system, developed in Tianmen, Hubei province, by Chujiang Shangpin Agricultural Technology Company. Seen from above, the system almost resembles a multi-layered ecosystem. Rice grows at the top, ducks move constantly through the shallow water, while crayfish shelter and forage below in the mud and water channels. In this system, the ducks continue doing what they do best, eating golden apple snails, snail eggs, crop pests, and young weeds, while also stirring the water and helping prevent insects and weeds from growing out of control. The crayfish play a different role. They make use of organic material that settles at the bottom of the field, including dead plant matter, organic debris, and some of the waste produced within the system. In doing so, they help clean the water and recycle nutrients that would otherwise be wasted. Meanwhile, the rice continues growing above, absorbing nutrients that have been cycled back into the system. The result is a field that functions almost like a closed loop. Less waste, less pollution, less dependence on chemicals, but more products coming from the same piece of land. According to some local agricultural reports, this system can increase total income per hectare by around 30–60% compared with conventional rice farming alone. That means 1 hectare of land can now produce not only rice, but also 200–300 ducks, hundreds of kilograms of crayfish, and higher quality rice that is more attractive to the market because of its ecological production process. In other words, instead of harvesting just one product, farmers can generate 3 sources of value from the same field. But the most interesting part is that this idea is not entirely new. In fact, it is a modern expansion of symbiotic farming systems that have existed in China for a very long time. For centuries, farmers in some regions have maintained rice-fish systems, and in some places these developed into rice-fish-duck systems, with fish swimming below, ducks moving above them, and rice growing across the field. These systems did more than produce food. They also helped maintain ecological balance, using natural processes to control pests and recycle nutrients. Some traditional farming systems of this kind in China, most notably the Qingtian rice-fish system in Zhejiang, have been recognized by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations as globally important agricultural heritage systems. That shows this is not simply a spontaneous idea, but agricultural knowledge that has been accumulated and tested over a very long period of time. However, these systems are not easy to maintain. They face several very real risks. The rural workforce is shrinking as younger people leave the countryside for cities. At the same time, modern chemical-based farming systems, although more dependent on purchased inputs, are simpler, faster, and easier to mechanize, leading many farmers to return to methods that are easier to manage. In addition, these integrated farming systems still have relatively low levels of commercialization and industrial development, creating significant obstacles to large-scale expansion. And on top of that, climate change with heavier rainfall, flooding, extreme heat, and increasingly unpredictable temperatures is disrupting the natural cycles that these systems depend on. Now let's return to Huang. Starting with 60 ducks in 2025, the flock helped noticeably reduce the number of snails and crop pests. But that solution also created a new problem. The ducks wandered into neighboring fields and ponds, forcing Huang to pay more than 20,000 RMB in compensation and eventually build around 1,500 meters of fencing to keep them under control. By 2026, nearly 100 ducks were still being kept in the fields, rice yields had recovered, and Huang had begun considering expanding the system to around 1,000 mu. More than 40 years after people first brought golden apple snails into Guangdong as food, they still have not been able to eradicate them. But perhaps complete eradication was never the real victory. Instead of searching for a stronger chemical, farmers are learning how to redesign the entire field: rice, ducks, fish, water, soil, and people all working together to keep the system in balance. If you had to choose, would you prefer faster chemical control or a self-regulating ecosystem that works over the long term? Leave your thoughts below, subscribe to the channel, and stay tuned for the next video, where we continue exploring how people are using nature itself to repair the problems they created.